Good evening. My name is Lauren Batchelder, and I'm a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this evening's event. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their communities and strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political issues or candidates. Before we begin this evening's program, I would like to remind you to turn off any cell phones or other devices that make noise. Tonight, Professor Dale Keene, an educator of politics here at St. Anselm, will be introducing our speaker, Stephen Davis. Professor Keene began teaching here in 1994, and in 2000 he became the founding director of the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. He serves as the senior advisor to the Ethics and Governance, Stewardship, and Investor Education Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome one of my favorite people on campus, Professor Dale Keene.
Thank you, Lauren. And I do wish to say Lauren is not even in one of my classes right now, so I appreciate that. As was mentioned, I've served as the founding director of the Institute, and since we opened this building September 6th of 2001, we've had many events in this room, many events in our building. But the events that have been most well attended, the events that have had people lean forward in their chairs, have been those events that spoke to us about the issues that we're addressing tonight. That ever since the crash of Wall Street 2008 and ever since the investment bank crisis hit, we've been asking lots of questions. And I find that citizens come, commoners come, and by commoners I mean the word literally, those people that are concerned with the common, those people who live in the common, us. We come and there's this hunger to learn about what happened. Why did it happen? Where's the future? Who's going to bring us into the future? There's this great concern that there's a few people looking out for a few people, but what about the common? And so I'm delighted tonight to introduce Dr. Stephen Davis, who's come to speak to these very issues. As you know from your program, Dr. Davis has served on boards, educational institutions, taught all over the world. He's presently at Harvard Law School, addressing these issues. He and some colleagues have recently published this book, What They Do With Your Money, How the Financial System Fails It, and How to Fix It. When I looked at the title, I thought, I hope that tonight Dr. Davis will say what they did with your money. I hope they'll say, what do they do with it? I need to learn more. And what should they do? What is it that should be done for the benefit of the common? And I'm delighted tonight to bring somebody to the Institute who's capable of speaking to these things and helping us to illuminate things rather than just bring heat to something. And with that, I'm glad to introduce to you Dr. Stephen Davis.
Thank you, Dale, and thank you, Lauren, and really thank the whole team, Ann and Chip, and just it's such a pleasure for me to be here. I live in Connecticut, but every 4 years since 1972, I've come up to the New Hampshire primary. We're leading a group of people. We had 80 people last time on the Saturday before the vote, and so this is sacred ground for me, and so I'm really delighted to be here and talk with you today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book and then invite your questions. So, but also, just as a quick note of introduction, our book isn't, and I've got two co-authors, it's not technically released yet, so St. Anselm's really got the first batch of books, and this is the first time any of our three authors has really talked about it. So I'm really excited to have this opportunity and also to engage with you and So please feel free to think about questions, ask them, and we'll get to as many as we can. So I'll start with a little bit of a political story, but I don't mean to do it for politics, so I'll just throw it out. It was January 20th, 2009 in Washington, on the Mall in Washington, and it was bone-chillingly cold, and I was sandwiched in and among 1.5 million citizens there for Barack Obama's inauguration. And I was there with my then 13-year-old son, Gabriel, and we had taken an overnight bus from New Haven to witness this historic event. And colossal jumbotrons dotted the mall, showing live video close-ups of the ceremonies taking place on the west front of the Capitol. And helpfully, there were captions that appeared along the bottom of each screen, so that those of us rather distant could tell what was happening and to follow the speeches and sounds. So early in the ceremony, way up on that balcony, someone introduced President George W. Bush. And as you might expect, a deafening roar of boos rose in a wave from the Capitol lawn to as far back as the Lincoln Memorial. But here's what caught my eye. The captions on the jumbotrons read, "Applause." So this was a little strange, and I relate this not to make a political statement, but as an illustration of a kind of an epic disconnect that in a way captures the message of our book, which, as Dale said, is called What They Do With Your Money. The financial system carries on business as usual, assuming that everyone else will applaud as usual. But the crowds below the balcony are no longer acting the way they're supposed to. They don't seem to be buying the message anymore. To take one example, a recent California survey showed that a mere 14% of working adults fully trust financial companies to manage and invest their retirement savings. Now that's toxic. We depend on the financial system to safeguard our savings so we can start businesses, pay for health care, buy homes, enable retirement, and afford college tuitions. Putting our money under the mattress is not an option if we want our economy to prosper. Indeed, our financial system has given rise to the greatest economic engine in human history. But as you know, that system, and we'll call it Wall Street for short, has drawn striking hostility this election year from both the left and the right. Trust has ebbed away. So try, for instance, just to identify the quotes from the presidential candidates this year. Just see if you can tell who said what. So here's one. Goldman is one of the biggest banks on Wall Street, and my criticism with Washington is they engage in crony capitalism. Any thoughts who said that? Hillary. Okay, it's a good guess. It was actually Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz said that. Here's another one. It shouldn't just be shareholders and taxpayers who feel the pain when banks make bad decisions. Executives should have skin in the game. No one should be too big to jail. Any guesses? Kasich, Bernie? You were right, Ned. All right, let's go back to you. Hillary. that one was Hillary. All right, here's a third one. The hedge fund guys are getting away with murder. They didn't build this country. These are guys that shift paper around and they get lucky. Trump. Yeah, you could tell that. Somehow that rhythm worked. It's unmistakable, I guess. And then finally, I say to the 1%, I say to Wall Street, I say to the billionaire class, watch out, we're coming after you. No surprise there too. Similar. Okay. So even though if that's not a mystery, there is another mystery, which is if the financial system is in fact so vital to us, how can it have so comprehensively lost public confidence? As the bipartisan candidate rhetoric shows, the uprising against Wall Street is all pervasive. Even Hollywood is actually deeply into it. If anyone's seen the Showtime series Billions, for instance, or movies such as Inside Job or The Big Short, and there's a George Clooney, Julia Roberts movie coming out next month called Money Monster. So, it's all pervasive. But the hostility is free-floating. Are we angry about CEO pay? Corporate political influence in the wake of Citizens United? Corruption? Greed? Income inequality? Fraud? A rigged system too big to fail? It's probably a porridge of all of the above. Somehow, we believe Wall Street has conspired to gain for itself at the expense of the many. But with no consensus on what the problem is, we clash over what to do about it. So I and my two co-authors contend that you and I can fix Wall Street by applying a mixture of time-tested values and cutting-edge technology. And I'll get to that. But let me start with a fundamental question for which in our book we go deep inside the industry's trade secrets. What do those folks on Wall Street really do with our money? Because we find, it turns out, that our own savings have become complicit in Wall Street's me-first culture without our knowledge and consent. Consider an arresting video that went viral in 2007. A man and a woman are huddled with a financial advisor to discuss their portfolio. The financial advisor walks them through gains in energy and tech stocks as they flip through a binder. You took a little hit on real estate, the advisor explains, but more than made up for it in genocide. As the two slowly turn to pictures of slaughtered children, the advisor looks in their stunned eyes and nods reassuringly. You're really making a killing in Darfur. Fade to black while an announcer asks, is your mutual fund funding genocide? Now with this unsubtle message, the producer, which was the Save Darfur Coalition, sought to make savers conscious that their invested capital might well be going without their knowledge to companies the group links to genocide. In short, it was saying, we don't necessarily know what happens to our money once we transfer it to agents. Now, you don't have to make up scenarios like that video. Think back almost exactly 3 years ago to April 24th, 2013. That was the day the 8-story Rana Plaza building collapsed in Bangladesh. More than 1,134 people died, most working in poorly regulated clothing factories on each floor. It remains the worst ever industrial accident in the garment industry. Many of us remember seeing news reports of rescue workers combing through the ruins looking for survivors. But there were other volunteers there too, not as visible. People from NGOs, picking through rubble in search of labels, sewn on nightgowns, on jeans or t-shirts, all meant for stores in places such as Manchester. Those labels would identify precisely which multinational companies were allowing suppliers to deploy workers in unsafe structures. But labels could also be used to expose which big institutional investors with shares in such companies had failed to ask the right questions about risks taken to boost profits. And I would ask, were they institutional investors you or your parents invest with? That's precisely the question that a few years ago some students at Oxford University began asking. They founded a group called Push Your Parents. You can see it at www.pushyourparents.org. The theme they embraced, and pardon me if I quote it more or less directly, was, quote, "Mom and Dad, did you know your pension is, expletive, up my future?" Push Your Parents was built on a fundamental insight. The agents we give our savings to for investment often have incentives to put their own commercial interests and values ahead of ours. Now let me unpack that, because here we come to a powerful source of the uprising against Wall Street. When I was a toddler in the 1950s, people had secure pensions through companies they worked for. Very little of their savings were locked in shares. Today, for a host of reasons, about 92 million Americans, or more than 1 in 3 adults, entrust savings to mutual fund companies such as Fidelity, BlackRock, and Vanguard. Indeed, some 20 cents out of every dollar Americans have to their collective name is invested in mutual funds. If you add in 401ks, IRAs, and other retirement long-term savings vehicles, some $37 trillion, more than half of the financial assets of U.S. households, that is, you and your parents' savings, is run by firms associated with Wall Street. So the question is, what kind of job do these firms do? Let's begin with the startling bottom line. A typical American saver using these channels of investment will wind up on retirement from a lifetime of work with a considerably smaller nest egg than they should. In fact, someone saving exactly the same amount each year, but living in the Netherlands, where rules are different, will end up with 50% more money to live on. 50% more money. Now, why is that? One big reason is fees. If you're paying a fund 1.5% a year to manage your savings, which is pretty common, compared to a low-cost 0.2% rate, that might not sound like a lot. But you'll end up with nearly 38% of potential lifetime savings going into financial industry fees. If you pay a top line 2% a year, again, doesn't sound like that much, you will gain at the end, but as much as half of your potential pension will have vanished by the time you need it. And by the way, one dirty little secret of the industry is that there is virtually no material difference in returns from a low-cost fund versus high-expense fund management. So we might think we're hiring expertise at the high rate, but what we're really buying, and expensively, is mostly luck. So under current rules, investment firms don't have to clearly spell out the full amount that is charged to our savings. Much of it just disappears, having passed through multiple financial intermediaries, each of which takes a kind of a stealth cut. Even the pros don't know where it goes. One big British pension fund learned in a recent review that it was paying 4 times what charges were supposed to be. And US public pension funds just admitted discovering that they were paying as much as 100% more than they thought to private equity managers. So the leakage could be described as a perfect, almost undetectable crime, except, of course, that it's entirely legal. Fees are hardly the only problem. And another little-known secret of the trade, the professionals who handle our savings are typically rewarded for drawing more customers to the fund rather than on efforts to press for better returns among companies they invest in. That's how bonuses are calculated and how resources are allocated. Just consider this. In 2012, one giant mutual fund company spent $136 million advertising how thoroughly it looks after client shareholder interests. But it expended only an estimated $400,000 actually doing it through voting client shares at companies held in portfolios. In other words, the fund spent a sum equivalent to 0.27% of its advertising budget on being a responsible investor. It literally employed a single full-time person to oversee the task of voting shares at more than 10,000 companies around the world, while the fund's big money went to marketing. Now, it may appear implausible to you and me that such a relatively under-resourced effort could responsibly advance client interests in votes that determine how thousands of corporations behave. But it's perfectly legal. Now, you may ask, isn't someone policing Wall Street to make sure agents act in our interests? Here's what I would call the biggest hidden failure in today's financial system. There is almost no effective oversight. Put aside for now that regulators have often looked the other way. That's kind of another conversation. Unlike practice in many other markets, U.S. companies with retirement savings normally have no board elected by savers to help ensure the right mutual fund choices. Now, the mutual funds themselves are outfitted with boards dominated by independent outsiders who are supposed to look out for our interests. But members are appointed by the very fund companies they oversee. Even as many directors try their best to do a good job, the system itself is simply misaligned. As author and fellow Red Sox fan Bobby Monks has written, it's as if the New York Yankees paid the salaries of all the refs in Major League Baseball. Wouldn't you doubt every call? Pension fund boards may be little better. According to a February survey of professionals by State Street, just 38% think that their board has a high level of general investment literacy. Yet almost none have measures in place to oust poor-performing board members. So the truth is, few of the agents we asked to handle our money would meet basic accountability and disclosure standards we have long expected of corporations. That governance gap has real consequences. Research suggests, for instance, that best governed funds outperform bottom ones by as much as 2.4% a year, which adds up to a lot before very long. So no wonder then, if we think back to the Rana Plaza disaster, that only a handful of mutual funds and other institutional investors were asking the right questions of Walmart, JCPenney, Benetton, and other multinationals doing business in Bangladesh. No wonder that many are publicly restrained when it comes to fossil fuel risks to sustainable growth. Last year, according to a survey by Ceres, which is an NGO that advocates on environmental issues, 9 top mutual fund companies opposed every single climate change resolution filed by shareholders at US companies, even as many other funds are changing. No wonder some of the biggest mutual fund companies either voted against or abstained on all 2015 shareholder resolutions calling for disclosure of corporate political spending in the wake of Citizens United. No wonder, too, that many such institutional investors using your or your parents' money routinely vote at corporate annual meetings for the kind of over-the-top CEO pay packages that stoke public resentment. Indeed, the next time you hear news that a corporate chief executive has been paid an outrageous salary, remember that it was most likely your shares, your parents' shares, or maybe even the college's endowment shares that were voted almost certainly without you knowing it to approve that award. Finally, no wonder that, with weak oversight of funds, the financial industry uses fees to quietly, but legally, siphon disproportionate value from your and your parents' nest eggs. But let me be clear, Wall Street has lost public trust not because finance is, or the people who work in it are, inherently evil, though instances of fraud clearly exist. It is because we have allowed it, quite legally, to separate us from our capital. The remedy is not to shoot every third person on Wall Street to make it okay, as Bill Clinton sarcastically put it a couple of weeks ago. The solution instead is to infuse the financial system with the balancing influence of tens of millions of citizens who provide it with capital. These are voices that have been missing in action in both Washington and Wall Street, allowing the playing field to tilt heavily in favor of the financial industry over savers. But if we were able to reboot instruments of accountability, the financial system will move of necessity closer into alignment with our money, values, and interests. Now, we have the tools to do this. In our book, we offer what we call an owner's manual for capitalism, aimed at making the financial system safer for use. We don't have to be consumed by free-floating hostility. We can act by bringing to life accountability remedies embedded but long dormant in free enterprise that parallel those regularly used in politics. Here, in what might be seen as a call to action, are 5 troubleshooting ideas to reboot the system. First, the US is ripe for a grassroots MoveOn.org style movement aimed at making our money agents accountable. Now, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. There's a group called Share Action, which you can see, www.shareaction.org, and I'm a trustee of that organization for full disclosure. It campaigns in Britain for an investment system that is a force for good, serving savers and communities and protecting our environment for the long term. It helps citizens watch over and put pressure on institutional investors, just as so many groups do for companies or politicians. We need a Share Action in America, and it could start right here as a student initiative. Secondly, take a leaf from Push Your Parents and press financial agents about whether they really work in your interests. For instance, you or your parents could check if agents have a fiduciary obligation to serve you first. Ask about all fees they charge. Find out whether they pay money managers for long-term performance or just for amassing more clients. and determine whether, when making buy and sell decisions, or when holding corporate shares, they pay attention to long-term risks stemming from climate change, human rights, corruption, governance, and CEO pay, as well as traditional narrow financial factors. If you aren't satisfied with the responses, find out how to lobby change. And if ways are blocked, find another agent, if you can, just as you'd vote out an office holder you disagree with. Third, apps can be a powerful tool to animate accountability at big funds. Take the example of Boycott, not boycott, but a group called Boycott, a free app launched in 2013, which aims to help consumers align their values with their purchasing. Now, it asks the question, if you look it up, have you ever wondered whether the money you spend ends up funding causes you oppose? Now, you can scan a product at a store to see if the company that produced it is involved in any ethical campaign you support. We can easily imagine a smartphone tool being developed to ask a parallel question. Namely, have you ever wondered whether the money you save ends up funding causes you oppose? It could compare pension or 401k plans, providing you with a picture of how accountable they are, how fees compare, how well or how poorly they align with what you believe. We have similar instruments in politics. Think of Common Cause's Democracy Scorecard, which ranks lawmakers. So app designers, start your search engines. Number 4, demand a common sense package of legislative reforms. For instance, investing institutions should have to disclose the equivalent of a nutrition statement so that consumers can learn in plain language whether their agents are configured to act in their best interests. They should have to disclose exactly how much money they deduct from client accounts. The U.S. Department of Labor estimates that such transparency could save at least $12.2 billion and allow savers to make more informed decisions. Legislation should require retirement savings plans finally to have real boards that police fees, conflicts of interest, and policies of investment funds. And laws could mandate that financial agents abide by fiduciary duties that put the client first. And finally, 5th, I would say it is time for a Magna Carta for citizen investor rights. We just marked 800 years since the Magna Carta set new standards of accountability for citizens, for political institutions. Today, a grassroots charter could set fundamental best practices on behalf of citizen investors for our financial agents. For instance, to name just 3 principles that could be part of such a charter. Number 1, no investment without representation. You should have the right to identify, assess, and help select or approve the fiduciaries responsible for managing your savings. Or second, you should be able to know where your money is invested, the performance of those investments, and all the costs that have been generated to achieving that performance. You should know of any potential conflict of interest and the ethics, investment, and time horizon policies of your financial agents. Or third, you should have the right to know how financial agents exercise ownership of corporate shares to improve long-term value, including whether they insist that portfolio companies address environmental, social, and governance opportunities and risks, You should have the right to be consulted on those policies. So to conclude, Wall Street today is a target of dread and hostility. But this uprising could still have a happy ending, or at least a good ending. Tamar Frankel, the well-known scholar of fiduciary duty at Boston University School of Law, put it this way the other day in talking about the remedies that I've just discussed. She said, part of the responsibility for Wall Street is that we accepted what they offered us. People were manipulated, yes, but not enough people and leaders stood up to say, this is leading to a disaster. Let us stop. You are starting to do it now. Now here's how we three authors put it in the wind-up to what they do with your money. We said, the financial industrial complex is going to need pushing, and reformers within the industry will need support. We have outlined practical fixes to stem its slow burn through our wealth. But citizen investors cannot rely on the goodwill of the entrenched to install such remedies. At the end of the day, it cannot just be about what they do with our money. It's about what we do with it. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions, comments, criticism. Tell me what I did wrong, whatever. So, yeah, sir.
Thank you for the presentation. I have always been frustrated when a large financial institution is caught doing wrongdoing. They pay penalties, $5–10 billion, but no one's held accountable. No one seems to go to jail, and then everything, the size of these institutions is a slap on the wrist, and then they go on their very merry way. Can you comment?
I agree. You're absolutely right. If we look at this financial crisis that started in 07, 08, and led to one of the Great Recession, there's nobody really who's been thrown in jail. There have been some lower level people that have been held accountable. It's worse than that. We taxpayers bailed out, as you know, financial institutions. Actually, at the end of the day, we've made out okay. We've actually earned a little money as a country from that. But nonetheless, we bailed out some big banks that nearly collapsed. And if you look today at who the CEOs are of those banks and whether the board's changed, the answer is there are a lot of CEOs that still are there. Not only are they not in jail, they're being paid lots of money. And their boards haven't changed all that much. Now, I would argue that Dodd-Frank has put some restraints in place. We're not by any means out of the woods on that. There's a potential for more catastrophe going forward. The banks are actually larger than they were in 2008. But it's also true that it may not have been large banks itself that caused the crisis. Clearly, there's a systemic risk there. But I think your point is accountability is really thin when it comes to the financial industry. And I would argue that the reason is because our voices have not been heard. If you go to Washington, on K Street, the lobbyists are there for the financial industry. Congress responds to them. So big institutions are well represented, but ordinary people are not well represented. This is why I think we make this case that it's time for people generally, citizens, to band together and set out what we need. What we need is accountability in the financial sector. We don't really have that today. So if we had accountability, then we could, I think, make progress. One of the problems that I would argue happened with the Occupy movement is it may have raised some good concerns and clearly represented the kind of free-floating anger that exists, but without a clear platform, without a clear institutional focus, it kind of disappeared as a group. Now, the concerns are still there, but it didn't result in major change in Washington. And that's what we need. We need to understand the problems, not make it free-floating, but real clear. Where are the accountability gaps and what are the solutions? There was another, yeah. Question there.
Thank you for being here tonight, Dr. Mike Dillon from Manchester. All due respect to the research that's gone into us, what I think is excellent, and admitting that I obviously haven't seen the contents of the book yet. What I heard you say tonight comes, in my mind, more from an informed consumer and or activist point of view than anything else. Speaking as one of more than 280,000 Federal Trade Commission certified victims of a mortgage servicer that literally tried to steal my house starting back in 2001. We've got the tools to enforce what needs to be enforced. The problem is that nobody wants to enforce it. The consumer voice has been heard in DC and in the regulatory bodies. It's been ignored, is what the problem is. When you get to a point where the Internal Revenue Service goes on record specifically stating that they are willingly refusing to enforce sections of their own code, such as 860, sections A through G, which govern the functioning of REMICs, real estate mortgage investment conduits, which held the vast majority of securitized mortgages. When you get a regulatory body like that, saying that they aren't even going to uphold their own regulations and laws, you're pretty much out of luck. And when a body of that magnitude refuses to enforce the laws that are already on the books, citizen uprising isn't going to cut it. And it has to start there, I fully recognize that. But the citizen uprising then has to go to the legislative body in order to get laws created to further the cause. That hasn't happened in the last decade and a half that I've been watching and been involved personally. And that's going to be something that needs to be overcome. And until we get the people in place that are actually going to listen to the individual citizens, we're not going to gain any ground.
Can I just ask you, what would be the solution that you would recommend?
That's a tough one, because how do you force the regulatory entities to do their job when you as an individual have little to no control over them? I mean, how do I go to the IRS and say, hey, knock your crap off, do your job? Yeah, Mike, thank you very much, go away. Here's what the response would be. I honestly don't know the answer. I've been struggling with that one for the better part of 15 years now.
Right, and you're not alone. I entirely sympathize with the frustration that you feel. It's, as I say, you're not alone. It's just my view that, and I come to this really from as a student of politics, that change comes through organization. Change comes when people get their voices heard. When their voices are not heard, then regulators, lawmakers, there's no particular benefit for them to take a strong position. So this is where I guess I would differ from some of the arguments that we should just overturn the system. I actually believe in the system, but I think that there are parts of the system that really haven't been exercised. And the accountability piece of it is something that hasn't been exercised. Just think about this one point. We're a capitalist country. We believe in free enterprise. I do as well. But the fundamental tenet of capitalism is when you own something, you get to say what happens to it. And what we've allowed to happen with the financial sector is, as I say, we've allowed the financial system to separate us from our property, from our capital, from what we own, our hard-earned savings. And because of that, these intermediaries have been able to grab a hold of law and regulation and shift it in their interests. If we really want to go back to free enterprise, what we need to do is to exercise, to bring accountability into the financial sector, and then we can really ignite capitalism in a much more powerful way. We can save more money, for one thing, and use and deploy our money in a more productive way. Yes?
Could you comment on whether you think credit unions are maybe somewhat higher ground than the, at least within the financial world, for us individuals trying to make choices on where we put this and that in our resources?
I mean, I think that I was going to make a uniform or generalization, and I probably will decide not to do that. And the reason is, I was going to say credit unions are quite a nice choice for the most part, because you have more of a say in the governance of, there's more accountability within credit unions. It's a more direct relationship, fewer agents involved. But we've also had credit unions that have had big problems. I'm not so much in this country, but there's one big credit union in the UK where a CEO was caught in a scandal, but it turned out that the board wasn't watching the store, and it caused a huge financial hit for everybody involved. So look, I think we have to just be real careful. We have to make sure that there are solid boards in place, whether it's a credit union or whether it's a mutual fund or some other investment vehicle. And we don't have those in place. We just don't, in many cases, we don't have them. Let me give you a quick example. It's related to your point, but slightly straying. A neighbor of mine used to, this was about 15 years ago, neighbor of mine used to work for Enron. And those of you may remember, Enron was a huge scandal in about 2001, went belly up, lots of fraud involved. And I said to this person, I said, well, I'm very sorry to hear, I'm sure your pension got wiped out, which is what happened with the workers at Enron in the United States. She said, no, her pension was fine. Why? Because she worked in the UK, where they have trust laws, so there are boards that overlook pension savings, and they're separate from the company. So that money was not tied up in Enron stock. It was fully protected from Enron, the company, even though it was Enron pensions. So my point is that what we need to do is to make sure that there are people who are accountable to us that watch the agents that we give our capital to. And if we do that, we can make sure that capital not only gives us, keeps as much of our hard-earned savings as possible, but also that capital conveys the right messages to companies about CEO pay, about corruption that caused the kind of crisis or the collapse at Rana Plaza that killed so many people. We need, or that would look over places like Volkswagen, which, as you know, recently got involved with basically lying about emissions standards. Again, that's a great case. There wasn't a board in charge, and the investors weren't really involved. So accountability is the way to resolve these things. Yes?
Thank you, by the way, great presentation.
Thank you.
I had a question on your position on private investment offerings, often structured and offered through exemptions from the SEC from SEC registration and regulation, and if this would positively impact the future by putting more power in the investor's hands and more direct connection with the investment that they're making, or whether this would promote, I guess, more options for Madoff issues or pyramid schemes,
Yeah.
etc.
That's a great question, and if I am getting it right, I'll try to answer. Tell me if I've got this wrong. But so, about 3 years ago, the Congress, in one of the few bipartisan acts that it sort of undertook, passed something called the Jobs Act, and the Jobs Act stripped away some of the shareholder protections that have been in place for decades for young companies, for new companies. High tech, for people that are trying to raise capital through alternative means, not necessarily through the stock market. And on the one hand, it's, it sounds great as a way of unlocking the power of capital in the United States. But the fact is that it did strip away a lot of protections. So like most things, it's possible that it could give rise to the next Apple or Google. But on the other hand, it could also give rise to the next Madoff. What it means is that people really have to be careful when you're investing in some of these startups that are exempt from our traditional rules about disclosure. Thank you for that question.
I've got a comment.
Let's bring the question, make sure everyone hears.
Hi, I've got a comment and a question. The comment being, lots of people used to be in a defined benefit as you opened up your talk with. And then all of a sudden that was taken away from people. And so you had an average guy working an average job who really didn't know a whole lot about investing, that all of a sudden was forced to manage their own retirement accounts. So many of those people turned to a mutual fund like Vanguard or somebody like that and say, what the hell do I know? I mean, I'm going to go with these guys. And try to do the best they could with the money they had that was just told to do. So I think that's doing their own responsibility and trying to figure out what to do with their money. They weren't really looking to see where this money was being invested because it was all of a sudden sink or swim, you're on your own. So I think maybe that's how part of it, Wall Street got away with this. Secondly, there are some mutual funds that are socially responsible. I know there's a guy right here from Manchester, used to be from Manchester, Joe Keefe, runs a wonderful fund out in Portsmouth.
Max,
What is it called again?
I think it's PAX.
PAX, P-A-X?
Or something.
Yeah,
PAX.
and so, my question is there a list of mutual funds like that people who are interested could go to invest in as opposed to, and I'm not running down Vanguard, but just going to a very reputable fund where you really don't know where the money's going?
Yeah, no, great points. Let me just talk for a moment about the first point, which is exactly, I entirely agree. It used to be, as I said, people had so-called defined benefit plans. So you didn't have to worry if you were an employee. Your company took care of the investments, and you knew exactly what you were going to get at the end of the day. But that was also a real different era. It was a real different era. In other words, it was an era when companies didn't have to worry about the investment part because people died early, to be frank, compared to today. And they had many more workers than they did retirees. So you could have had a chimpanzee running your fund, and you would have been fine. You could generate more than enough money to pay all your obligations. That's changed today. Today we have fewer workers, many more retirees, and they're living much, much longer. So it means there's an enormous pressure on returns. And if you don't make those returns, it's going to cost. If you're a company, it's going to cost you, it's going to take from your bottom line. If you're a taxpayer and you're in the state of New Hampshire or state of Connecticut, wherever, if you can't make those returns, the taxpayers are going to have to fill in that gap because those are contractual obligations to pay those pensions. So there was this move toward defined contribution which essentially means it's the 401k approach, where people are handing their money to mutual funds and having them basically run their retirements. It's a system that is, arguably designed by the mutual fund of financial industry, and it's a huge benefit to them. It's kind of like an ATM, basically, because there's very little oversight. And even if you're a smart investor, the data show this. There are some studies, many studies that show, even if you're a really smart person and you know the financial market, you're typically a terrible investor. You make all the wrong decisions. So the fact is, we need to have a different kind of long-term retirement system. And I didn't get into that in this address, but we do talk about it in the book. There needs to be a different kind of pension system. Briefly on your other point, there are some great mutual funds that do involve, such as Pax World and Calvert and Domini and many others, that address those kinds of risks. By risks, I mean climate change, corruption. You might have particular values that you want reflected in your fund, and therefore you would look at those kinds of funds and pick them. Or you may just be someone who says, hey, I want someone who invests on my behalf to look at the whole 360-degree measure of risks, which includes corruption and climate change. Those are real financial risks. Forget whether you agree with the politics of climate change. There's very little doubt that there are financial impacts from these. So you want those to be taken into account. Yeah, this gentleman.
Yes. I don't know, this may not quite be your focus, but I heard Vanguard mentioned, and Jack Bogle, who's pretty controversial in the investment community, those for-profit investment consultants and brokers. But he is the index, he's the originator of the index funds. I have about maybe 40% of my equity in his index funds. Well, not his anymore, he's Vanguard, but Vanguard index funds. If I had everything in index funds, I'd be much better off in Vanguard. So, and he's also been quite vocal about some of these transparency and ethics issues. Not quite so much in the social responsibility, because he looks at the overall, broad picture. But I wonder what your opinion is of his efforts.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm proud to say that he was one of the blurbers of our book. So if you see it, he's prominently, Jack Bogle is I personally think he's one of our America's treasures. He's really, not only having invented Vanguard, which is very successful, but also as someone who really analyzes the industry and puts forward opinions, whether you agree with them or not. They're very well resourced and very forcefully put. So I think he's great. Now, I don't, you've sort of put me in a position where I might have to make an advertisement for Vanguard, so I'll try not to do that. But I did say that, that if you're looking for low-cost funds that have, say, a 0.2% or close to that charge, you're going to do pretty much as well as if you were paying 2%, not 0.2, but 2%, a lot more, in other words. You'll do pretty much the same, except you won't pay as many fees. So I would have, there are some other issues with Vanguard that I would have, which is that I think it has gotten much better, like many of the funds, but they still need to do much more to look at all those climate change, corruption, non-traditional, non-financial types of ways of investing. They still, in many ways, they're better, as I say, but they're not. If you look at the figures last year, typically a lot of those funds voted against climate change resolutions that are simply asking companies for, reports. So we need, I would say, we need some more work on the part of those funds, even though they perform a great service.
We have a question back here, sir.
Yes.
Hi, I teach here at St. Anselm College and live in New Hampshire. I have a couple of thoughts. One is this seems like a real collective action problem, and I'm reminded of the people who were supporting Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders because they're so upset about the free trade acts and yet never check the label of anything they buy to try to buy it in America and instead only look at the price tag. And that they'd like the law to be changed to have the free trade agreements reverse and be forced to pay higher prices in order to save those jobs. In a sense, it seems like what's missing from what I've heard tonight is congressional action. I mean, or to channel Bernie Sanders a little bit, that there's a real conflict of interest with the donors from the financial services area and Congress, but it seems like some of those fees could certainly be regulated. It seems that a lot more money could be going into SEC and regulation, and that a small-time investor like me, through my TIAA, which is all in index funds, is not going to have a whole lot of influence compared to large investors and what they want and their immediate influence in Congress. And so, in a way, this seems almost a tilting at windmills kind of thing, rather than trying to work on campaign finance reform and trying to do more with regulatory agencies.
Well, thank you. I would respectfully disagree in this way. I was very involved when the Dodd-Frank Act was in creation, which was not a pretty thing to watch, but okay. And the investors were at the table in that discussion. And by investors, I'm talking about big institutional investors, not ordinary people, but big institutions. And the senators at one critical point said, okay, you can have one of two of your priorities, but not both. That's just the way it is. It's just the politics of it. That's what we're going to do. And that's what happened. They only got one of the two things. We can talk about which one. But they got one of the two things. And it was slightly helpful, but actually it was overturned later in the court, so the whole exercise turned out to be meaningless. My argument is you cannot now go to Congress because you really won't get very far because the interests of beneficiaries, in other words, by citizen investors, are so outgunned that anybody who promises any big change, I think, isn't going to be able to deliver. That's why I suggest, in particular, the first thing I suggested was we need a grassroots group. There is one in the UK called Share Action. We need one in the United States. It's not something we have to reinvent. It's not something pie in the sky. It's very practical politics. But it needs to be a group that brings the voices of the beneficiaries, the citizen investors, into the mix in Washington. And if we don't have that, then the other proposal that I had, which was a series of legislative acts, they really won't get very far. That's just an opinion. Yes?
Yeah, it seems whenever there's a crisis and there's a call for reform that there's some sort of proposal to fix the system, whether it be the problem with the banking industry. But a lot of times it seems that the regulators or the regulated have the control rather than the regulators. And I guess if you look at the banking industry as a whole, I think there's been only one or maybe two banks that have been created in the United States since the banking crisis, and one was just down the street. I guess could you speak to the influence and the control that the regulated have over the regulators? Because they tend to use that, I guess, as a barrier to entry to control their market.
Yeah, and well, I agree with you. The issue is, of course, not just with banking. It's true for pharmaceutical. You kind of name it. We of course intend to have independent regulation, but what happens too often is that those that are regulated, in particular, in this case, the banks, have rather too much to say. And I think that's the reason why it's taken so long, for example, for Dodd-Frank. The Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 was designed to create reforms so that we wouldn't have the kind of huge financial crisis that we had in 2008. The Dodd-Frank, you may have seen, but just, what was it, 2 or 3 days ago, one of the regulators in Washington came out with rules that for the first time since Dodd-Frank was passed, requiring such rules, put in some modest regulations about CEO pay in the financial sector. It's taken 6 years to get this modest reform. Now, that shouldn't be. And I would argue is the reason why it is that way is because, again, we don't have the voice of the people that are capital, who provide the capital to banks. But, remember, the people in this room are representative of where capital in America comes from. It's from us. It's from savings, middle-class people, working people who put savings in banks and in mutual funds and other places, if they can afford to put any. That's where the capital comes from. But unfortunately, that's not how it seems to be reflected in Washington. Yes?
So if I understand you correctly, it's people, common people, need to show up and speak up, but they need to do it through a mechanism like shared action. But shared action isn't here.
No, which is why I said it's right for groups to take it on. Now, share action is, don't tell anybody. No, no, we're thinking about, share action is thinking about setting up here itself. But no one has to wait for that. There is a model out there. Students like those at Oxford that did push your parents. We can do that. There's no barrier to doing it. It's, in a way, it's a mind shift from thinking about politics, trying to change our congresspeople or senators. Use that accountability, but use it for capital. It's capital.
Right. But I think the common person really needs to know who to call, who to talk to, who to plug into.
Right.
That mechanism doesn't seem to be here.
No, and that's why I think the time is right for exactly that kind of mechanism. And what makes it right is what we've heard in this campaign, just like the quotes that I said at the outset. At this moment in American political history, what we see is a common and bipartisan disgust, to put it strongly, with the financial system, Wall Street. So that's something we should be now taking advantage of, to turn it into some infrastructure.
A lot of energy is there, and it would be a
Right.
shame to lose it.
Exactly,
So
because
to
right
direct
now,
it.
as I was saying, it's free floating. If it's free floating, it's ephemeral.
So how do we nail it?
We nail it. I'm waiting for some students here at St. Anselm's to pick up the cudgel and create this group. It happened with MoveOn.org. It's happened in the past. So we need that focus now on capital, democratic capital. Are we? Any other? No, we're actually past the hour. But any further questions? Okay. If not, I really want to thank you all.